Hello and welcome back, everybody. This is a continuation from our previous stream where we talked about the First Crusades with Bede of Britannia. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you, AI, and so glad to come back and follow on from our last topic.
No, it's great, and I was looking forward to the Second Crusade because it's criminally, I think criminally Bede underlooked by many people. You know, I think the First Crusades because it was a major operation done, and one of the being the first of its kind was a very sort of gleaming success. And then of course there's a big focus on the Third Crusade due to due to us being English and the dominance of English civilization in history. So a lot of when you talk about medieval periods, and particularly the Crusade, there's a lot of earnest on the English perspective. And so, of course, when you come to think of Crusades in England, the one figure that stands out is Richard the Lionheart, King Richard himself. Would you say that's a sort of fair that there's a, you know, in some ways there's a bit of a too much of a focus, and we don't really look at the Second Crusades, which is in some ways, and this is what we'll get through on this stream. It was almost like a world, Europe, Middle East spanning conflict, where not only was it in Syria, and in the Crusader states, but also in Spain and partly in the Baltic what's now northern Germany region against the pagan Slavs. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, I there wasn't any alliance between the pagan Slavs and the Muslims. I've that's something I've I and this is why I don't use Wikipedia, people. I saw it on Wikipedia the other day. There was like some sort of reference of like an alliance. They class it in in the columns of opponents and stuff and allies. And for some reason that in this version, the Wends were allies to the Zengi dynasty. So
I mean, that's absolutely absurd.
yeah, that maybe in Crusader Kings, maybe some mad walkthrough of Crusader Kings, you could come up with that. But no, no, of course that would not be the case. And um, there even even when it came down to the Moors in Spain, there was no um, direct contact or any you know acknowledgement of what was going on. But from the Christian world perspective, this was a um, this was these crusades were extended to different regions. And though I will say the Wendish Crusade, a lot of historians don't include that into the official chronological events of the Second Crusade. It's just it was a crusade which happened at the same time. I, however, think it should be included because the German bishops at the time did petition the Pope, who accepted um, crusade activity there. So I I don't know about you, Bede, but I do include it because from contemporary understanding, it was part of this Christendom struggle.
I suppose we could say that's fair. I mean, I see it more as part of what's known as the Ostidlung or the Drang nach Osten, the drive towards the east, the expansion of Germany into what is now places like Brandenburg and across the Oder River into what is now Prussia and Silesia. So I guess I see it more in that respect. But yeah, in terms of seeing it as like a religious conflict, I mean, ultimately from these events would have the eventual creation of the Teutonic Order in Prussia. So as a kind of Baltic Crusader state. So yeah, I do appear to have some sort of troll in the chat.
Well, I mean the um. Oh, I see. Yeah, in chat, Allah is king. I'm guessing that is because I've never heard a Muslim refer to Allah as king. That's like that's like a play on Christ as king. So I guess that is a troll. Um, yeah, banned. Anyway, um, that being said, moving past that, um, we shall start with the chronological order. By the way, if you are an Arab, Yo-Yo Bumchuck, um, it is worth noting that this uh, this crusades Christians killing Christians. I'm guessing he's probably referring to maybe the Fourth Crusade. You know, when they sacked Constantinople and you had the sort of brief period of the Latin Empire. Maybe that's what he was referring to, but maybe he's not intelligent enough to know the difference between which crusades we're talking about. And also
Well,
the
the fact he
fact that
said Allah is king, I think that says he's a Muslim. So
Allah is king. I've never heard. I mean, well, I mean that's if he's a Muslim. Somebody hack into his. I want to find him so I can report him to his local imam because that's blasphemy. Maybe we can get his like father or uncle to honor kill him. Fucking deserve it, heretic.
well, in Minecraft.
In Minecraft, I'm joking, of course. Yeah, jokes. So Allah is God, not Allah is king. Get it right. So even I know more about his fucking religion than he does. Anyway, sorry. So we left in 1099. So just as Jerusalem had fallen, the establishment of the Crusader state. So this would be the Kingdom of Jerusalem under the Anjou, and then the Beaumont would take Antioch. You also had the County of Edessa as well, which probably County Edessa is was quite an important one because it's locale in relation to the Silk Road, which I think we mentioned a bit last time. And so this was kind of it is fair to say that a part of the Latin West was open up to the wider East, even beyond Muslim lands going into the Far East as well. There was some element of a trade that was open up. And bearing in mind before, I mean, of course, they weren't the first Christians because this would be the Eastern Roman Empire, but the Latin West, due to its the proximity and geography, would just naturally cut off. And so in some ways the Byzantine East didn't have that I guess you could say monopoly that they had in previous centuries over the West. So in 1119, we'll start with 1119, that the armies of the Crusader states were defeated at the Battle of the Field of Blood. So this was this is where you had the breakdown of we talked about last time, the Seljuk Empire, which was made up of modern day Iran, Iraq, and northern Syria, well, Syria, we'll just say Syria at large, and into what's most of hinterland Anatolia. And over the this period, you would see a decentralization of the Seljuk Empire, where you had these smaller states, Turkic-run states, which would compete for dominance. This would include Aleppo, Mosul, and also Damascus. And Bede, do you know much about the Battle of the Field of Blood at all? Is there anything you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, I remember reading about it quite a while ago. if I recall, that was between the Crusaders and the Turks, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was between the Crusaders and the Turks, and it was a massive defeat. It was particularly it was against Antioch, and it was a massive defeat for Antioch. I think in even a great deal of Tancred and Bohemond's um, companions were killed in this exchange, and it created this succession crisis over who should be the um, the count of or the you know of Antioch, as well as its various vassal positions, due to the high death toll. And this was from Aleppo, from the Islamic ruler of Aleppo, and you would have the King Baldwin II of Jerusalem would had to come in to protect Antioch, largely due to the fact that it was predominantly it was the ports, the sea access, which was most important as well, but also the balance of power in the region. And so you had and then in 1121 you had the assassination of Al Afdal, Wazir of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. Um, and then in the following year, Count Jocelyn of Edessa was captured by Turks. Um, but then at the same time, members of the Hashishin order um, assassinated leader Il Ghazi Ibn Aturk, and then you had the succession by Timur Tash Hassim al-Din as Artikid ruler.
The assassins at this time are wreaking absolute havoc in Iran, in the north around Alamus and various other fortresses. They even assassinate one of the Abbasid caliphs. Interestingly enough, so yeah, they were really causing a lot of destabilization because as soon as one ruler is able to sort of come in and consolidate the Seljuks, they get murdered by the assassins, which further causes political fragmentation. Another death that's important to mention is that a year before the Field of Blood, we had the death of Alexius Komnenos and the succession by his son John. And because of what John does during this time is that he's able to wage a series of campaigns into Anatolia against the Sultans of Rum and campaigns into the Crusader states, where he's actually able to force the nominal vassalage of Tripoli, Antioch, and Edessa to him for protection, because after the Field of Blood, obviously those northern Crusader states were somewhat vulnerable, and the Byzantines had a strong enough military, and John had enough of a fearsome military reputation.
Yeah, and sorry, the Count of Jocelyn was, I believe, he was he was of as I said, he was the Count of Odessa, and he wasn't particularly friendly with King Baldwin, and they had many public spats, which resulted in um, the I guess you could say sort of a lack of cooperation. Only it was only when I say Bohemond, I mean Bohemond II of Antioch was sort of this broker within the Crusader states. Though the main problem was that there was this feeling that the Kingdom of Jerusalem at this time would try and absorb the rest of the Crusader states into a greater Crusader kingdom. That would expand the entire Mediterranean coast of the East. And the problem is, because of the battlefield blood, it meant that the only person they could really turn to was Baldwin II, and in many fortresses in what's now northern Syria, leading to Antioch, were because of the high casualty, there wasn't anyone to guard, and so a lot of these fortresses just either surrendered or were easily captured by the forces of Aleppo and Mosul. And you have this in the following year of 1123, King Baldwin II captures Haraput, and which results in the death of Sultan Shah ibn Ridwan, which weakened the Damascus Emirate, which was the most powerful. So what you have is, due to King Baldwin, he is able to weaken both the Emirate of Damascus, but also Aleppo and Mosul. And this weakening allows him to, have a form of dominance over Antioch and also Edessa to some point. Though, as you mentioned, the Byzantines were able to have their input and assert their own control. But also you had this is where you would have the rise of the Zengi, who would fill that power vacuum in Aleppo, Mosul, and even in the Emirate of Damascus, and they would become this powerful Turkic warrior emirate, and would then go on to conquer Edessa.
Yes, just to talk a little bit about that. So the founder was Imad al-Din Zengi. So he was a Turkic Atabeg, which is the word. It's just a name for like a military chief or warlord. Typically, if a Turkish warrior was put in charge of what was then an Arabic emirate, they usually took the title of Atabeg, and that's where we get our modern Turkish word bey, comes from Atabeg, and so he rises in military service under the Seljuk Empire, originally as the sort of governor of Iraq in sort of the early 1120s, and then on the death of the ruler of Mosul, Aksunkur al-Busurki, Zengi becomes then the Atabeg of Mosul in 1127, and he holds that title for the rest of his life. And later, as you mentioned, he would then expand into Syria, taking over Aleppo.
Yeah, and at this time within the Seljuk Empire, you had these series of civil wars break out, particularly between Iraq and Western Iran, and so you do have like this sort of crumbling of authority, where you had the Abbasids ruling in Iraq, in Baghdad, and I guess you could say the shrinking Seljuk state or core state of that just being what resembles not really modern Iran, but like the Persian part, sort of the Persian region that you would think of today. So yeah, I'll just bring up the. So what was the fall of Edessa? So what year was that?
That would have been 1145.
So it was 1145.
Oh, sorry, 1144. Sorry.
Okay, 1144. Yeah. So
Yeah. I'll carry on.
Imad al-Din Zengi is the conqueror. Oh, that's it. Conquers eastern half of the Crusader county of Edessa, and then Quara Aslan Fakir al-Din becomes the Artukid ruler of Hesin Kaffa region of southern eastern Anatolia. And this was, I guess you could say, began the shockwaves around Europe. That the county of Edessa was completely overrun by the Zengi, and as a result, you had at the same time Armenian rebels in Sicilia defeated a Byzantines, um, and Count Raymond of Antioch accepts the sovereignty of the Byzantine Emperor Eugenius II. Sorry, the he accepts sovereignty of the Byzantine Empire. Pope Eugenius II then proclaims in 1145 the Second Crusade, and one of the main focal voices of this was Sir Bernard of Clairvaux, who preaches the Crusade in the Rhineland, which is it's the same area where the First Crusade was preached, and is also the if people watching as well, the thumbnail is Sir Bernard as well. Do you have anything else to add on that point, Bede?
All I'll say is, shortly after his victory over the Crusaders in conquering Edessa, in 1146, the year before the Second Crusade is launched, Zengi dies, and he's succeeded by his two sons. His eldest son, Saif al-Din Ghazi, succeeds him in Mosul, and then his younger son, better known as Nur ad-Din Zengi, succeeds him in Aleppo. And we're more interested in Nur ad-Din because he would be the more successful son. So Nur ad-Din would he would conquer Damascus. So he would have Aleppo and Damascus under his control. So he would conquer Damascus in 1154, so after the Second Crusade. But from there, obviously, he has most of Syria under his control, with the exception of Antioch, and he would prove to be the sort of main antagonist of the Crusaders, really, up until before the rise of Saladin. And he was a very well-respected ruler, because his name, Nur-ad-Din, is actually a title. It's Arabic for the lighter faith or the lighter religion. And it was also known as Al-Malik al-Adil, or the Just King in Arabic.
I've just brought up a map here of the, what the sort of Crusades. So we have here, of course, the fighting that would go on from Antioch down into Damascus, and the route of the crusading force. But we also have, if you look up near Stettin and what's now northern Germany, northern Poland, on the Baltic, the Wendish Crusades against the Wends. And then you'll see here from crusades from England, Scotland, and the Flemish, who were traveling around the Atlantic coast. They never reached, or most of them didn't even reach the Holy Land. They stopped in Portugal, the Kingdom of Portugal, to help and assist the king with the capture of Lisbon as well. So as you can see with this map, this is I mean, it's almost like it's like a world war sort of thing. Three different theaters going on, though, I would say two, you could argue, is somewhat connected. One was a bit of a separate endeavor, as I said, with the Wendish Crusade.
So they're three separate conflicts, all sort of interconnected, largely through the motivation of religious warfare. So
Yeah. So sticking with Sir Bernard of Clairvaux, he was preaching the Crusades in the Rhineland, and like last time, persecutions of the Jews in the Rhineland, the assassination, as you mentioned, of Imad al-Din Zengi, and then succeeded by Saif al-Din Ghazi bin Zangi in Mosul. Atabeg Anil of Damascus then seizes control of Bala al-Bak, makes truce with the governors of Hims and Hama. And in this time, King Conrad III of Germany agrees to participate in the Second Crusade, and then leaves an unsuccessful. So we talk about his unsuccessful invasion of Seljuk Sultanate of Rum by. Actually, that's a good point. Agrees to participate, and then you had the unsuccessful campaign by Emperor Manuel against the Sultanate of the Rum.
Yeah, so just to touch on that, so I mentioned John. Well, a couple of years before the Second Crusade, so in 1143, John dies tragically by accident. I think, if I recall, I think he cuts himself on a poisoned blade or arrow because I think he was hunting, and obviously that gets infected and he dies. And then he chooses to make his younger son Manuel his heir, and we now have Manuel Komnenos. And so Manuel is a relatively young emperor when the Second Crusade happens, and yeah, there's a great controversy because obviously Manuel allows, because the two principal crusading armies, you've got the German forces under Conrad III, and then you've also got I believe it's the King of France, Louis VII, and so they've got this Franco-Germanic force march through the Byzantine Empire, as you can see on this map, and again, like the First Crusade, there's tension because the Crusaders, pillage and get a bit looty as they're marching through the Balkan provinces. And so there's that issue. They arrive in Constantinople. Manuel sort of hosts them. He then obviously allows them to march on. And what happens is, as the Crusaders are sort of marching through Anatolia, as they near the Seljuk sort of frontier, they find they suddenly get attacked and ambushed by Turkish horse archers, and they're forced to withdraw. And the Crusaders believe that Manuel is in cahoots with the Muslims, essentially, that he's this whole endeavor is like a betrayal. And what then ends up happening is they decide to push on anyway and try and take Damascus. But when they go to do so, they do so without the aid of the king, I believe it's King Fulk of Jerusalem. And so they go and take Damascus with little supplies. Nur ad-Din comes to the defense of Damascus, and the Crusaders are completely BTFOs and forced to withdraw. And I think that's part of the reason why the Second Crusade isn't discussed very much, because it was a complete failure.
And what's quite interesting is in the First Crusade, and this is something I probably should mention this from the start, but in the First Crusade, it was undertaken by dukes, counts, a couple princes, and then many unlanded nobles, knights. You didn't have any direct monarchs, kings or emperors, apart from obviously the Eastern Roman Emperor, but that he was the separate. But you didn't have any Latin monarchs directly going in the First Crusade. And by the time you get to the second, and then later on, when it comes to various crusades, it would be normalized that actually this would be led by whether it be the king or the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of England, France, and so with the Second Crusade, this is the first time we actually see, I guess, on more of a grander scale, where the armies are led by kings, emperors, and also sultans and self-declared shahs on the Islamic side.
No, certainly it is interesting. I think on the First Crusade, because there was a opportunity for land and glory, I think that's why it appealed to a lot of nobles and unlanded warriors than necessarily kings. Whereas with the Second Crusade, I think now these states have been established, I think there's a sense of urgency where the kings themselves need to go and take up the cross for Christendom. And I will say, in the case of Conrad III of Germany, it was possibly because maybe he wanted to cultivate a better relationship with the Pope, because as we know, the Holy Roman Empire is racked with this fractious relationship with the papacy. I mean, you mustn't forget about 20, 30 years before this, you have the investiture controversy, which is issue over who has the right to appoint bishops? Is it the emperor or is it the pope? And
The
obviously,
Guelph and the Ghibellines
well,
faction.
that wouldn't really be until the following century when you have Stupamundi, Frederick II onwards. But yeah, we're sort of seeing the beginnings of that here. And another point to notice is obviously when we say it's called Conrad III of Germany, it should be noted that he wasn't actually crowned emperor, because when it came to the Holy Roman Empire, you were elected king of the Romans and then given the various royal titles, king of Germany, king of Italy, king of the Isles of Burgundy, king of Lotharingia. But to be made emperor, you actually had to be crowned by the Pope, and obviously what was incumbent on that is you had to have good relations. And so obviously very famously, I think it was Heinrich or Henry IV. He had to make a humiliating walk and penance at Canossa for the Pope to crown him emperor. So, and I think it's also interesting with Conrad, because I think he was actually the first king of the Romans to never be crowned emperor, and it was largely due to not exactly having great relations with the Pope. And so I think he hopes a successful crusade may help solidify his position.
Yes, he wouldn't be the last either. There were, as me and Mitch covered, there was one that didn't even bother to show up to his coronation. So,
oh, that was Wenceslaus of Bohemia, wasn't it? And it was
yeah,
your
that
kingdom
was
become
it.
deliverance
Yeah,
dream.
yeah, that was it. That we were looking at their. I mean, they make out in the game that he was. There's a reference to say that he was actually just like he just went out to like a brothel and got drunk. I don't know if that happened, but he didn't bother to turn up. But and of course his brother, the King of Hungary, Sigismund, would later be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, and also the last of the House of Luxembourgs to do so. So yeah, you do have, and then you had Rupert. There's another fella called Rupert of the Palatinate who was also King of the Romans as well. Um, so this was like but the problem was you had this is what time when you had the Western Schism as well with um, the the the, the Pope in Avignon. I think you had the was it Pisa and Rome as well?
Possibly. Speaking of that, actually, if I recall, there was also a certain Richard of Cornwall. He was an English prince who was the younger son of King John. He was actually elected king of the Romans, ironically, but again, he was never crowned emperor. So that's also an interesting episode in English history.
Yeah, you do get like these funny sort of successions like that. Um, so yeah, this was so we talk about the Christian plans here. So I got here in this is from I got a book actually got a book actually on the Second Crusade by David Nichols, the same one who wrote the uh, book on the first one. So he says here the Christian plans, unlike their predecessors in the First Crusade, the leaders of the Second Crusade had a reasonably accurate idea of the distance, terrain, and climate factors and foes they would be facing. On the other hand, the plans for such a long-term, long-distance campaign had to remain flexible, not at least because circumstances could and did change between the mustering of forces and their arrival in the Middle East. Furthermore, communication was so slow that it could just take a year for an official sanctioned report or document to get from Jerusalem to the courts of Western Europe. Rumours, of course, flew faster and was greatly feared that those trying to control events, popular enthusiasm was almost as uncontrollable as rumour at a time when those in authority had limited real power, and as a result, the church had little choice but to bow to popular pressure, eventually sanctioning crusading campaigns in the Baltic, Iberian Peninsula, and North Africa and North Africa. Meanwhile, the papacy tried to keep senior secular leaders focused upon the Middle East, where the initial plan had been to regain the city and county of Edessa. So that was David Nichols' sort of thing. That there was you kind of had maybe even like populist figures from below that were causing this. The crusading fever came from the masses below, and in many ways it was people within that. You had people within in the Spanish kingdoms and Germans in the north who were, their conception of crusades was what was going on with them, and there was a difficulty with the church because of course the Catholic Church really wanted to focus on, as it said here, on the Crusader states, and not really having to think about, well, Spain and the pagan, Balts, who were not on a scale of threat than the Turkic kingdoms in the east, and also importance to Christianity. Um, Reality is, at this point, Spain was a divided peninsula. It didn't hold an importance to Christianity as places like Jerusalem or Antioch or even Alexandria. At this point, many Christians would have said that places like Carthage and Alexandria would have been significantly more important than anywhere in Spain due to its, you know, the historical connections of the you know church history and of the church fathers.
Certainly.
So the Pope used the First Crusade as a model and attempt to plan the second one. However, King Louis VII dismissed King Roger of Sicily's suggestion that part of the French contingent travel through southern Italy before crossing the Adriatic to the Byzantine territory, um, mainly because um, King Louis didn't trust uh, Emperor Manuel, that nothing would happen with Roger and the Normans, Sicilian Normans, due to the tensions there. And so Louis
Oh,
followed.
actually, just to add to that, during the Second Crusade, the Sicilians were actually at war with Byzantium. They were actually raiding Greece. So that's also part of the reason Manuel was a little bit reluctant to work too closely with the Crusaders and send an army to Anatolia, because he was having to defend his western front from the rampaging Normans again.
Yeah. And so Louis elected to travel um, through the Danube through Germany, Hungary, and then cross into the Byzantine-controlled Balkans, a route that Conrad III had already planned upon as well. And so Conrad's army was able to move faster than the main contingent of the First Crusade, and had done because of a much better preparation, and also a good last minute re-establishment of good relations with Hungary, um, the gathering of fleet and transport ships to carry supplies along the Danube, and carrying of the um, uh, prefabricated wooden bridges. Yeah, so they set up. It's quite interesting actually. They had these ships or barges with pre-made, like almost like in World War Two. When you see those like ready-made bridges for tanks and stuff. You had like these ready-made prefab bridges for the sheer number of soldiers and the Crusaders to cross the Danube. Which, if you ever see the Danube, Bede, it is wide. It's very few parts which is narrow. It is wide as hell, and it's very, very um, difficult if to cross in that sort of way. Um, it acts as a natural barrier. So uh, it was a huge military operation that was that Conrad was operating on.
Certainly, no, that's it's interesting that they had access to those sort of things.
Yeah, I mean, he had an army of carpenters. I mean, the army, Conrad's army, was larger than from the First Crusade, which is, I mean, and that was quite a large one as well. But you also had an army of carpenters and engineers as well. That's one thing that I noticed with reading around this was that Conrad actually really invested in engineers, particularly when these would be the same people who would construct siege. So his his plans were obviously for many sieges of, forts and cities, of course. This was his, and so you had this sort of grand um, engineering sort of core uh, of his military, along with the naval maritime contingents. Um, the other routes, of course, through the Straits of Gibraltar, um, and the Balearic Islands as well, so through the Mediterranean. And so with the Atlantic Maritime Expedition, um, so yeah, we'll just briefly talk about the capture of Lisbon, because at this time you also had on the movement crusaders from England, also from Germany, but also Flemish and Scottish
I also
crusaders.
believe you had a substantial Norwegian group of knights as well, or known as the Norwegian Crusade.
Yes, there was a Norwegian crusade as well, which was again, I believe they stopped in London as well. So they were sort of following the same route as the English, um, and the German Flemish around the Atlantic, and the Norwegians. I believe they would sack cities right in the south of Andalusia. They in the heart of the more uh, or in the heart of the Islamic um, you know territories in the south, which wouldn't be a threat to the Christian states usually. They would so their protection wasn't real. I mean, you had their navy and all that, but it wasn't a great threat usually. But yeah, they would sack and I'll just bring up here actually because
Yeah, I've just had to double check. Sorry, the Norwegian Crusade was actually about 40 years earlier. It was in the aftermath of the First Crusade. It's when King Sigurd of Norway went with like an armed escort. It was essentially like an armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So they didn't really do any fighting. He just sailed there, went to Constantinople, met Alexius, then went on to Jerusalem, and yeah, he met King Baldwin.
yeah, yeah.
But it's
I mean,
noteworthy because we talked about the idea of kings firstly leading crusades, but it was technically the first time that a Western Christian king visited the Holy Land.
I think because he was inspired by the nobles of going there and the idea of a king. Because from my understanding, Norwegian king, he combined it as he sort of combined the concept of crusade and the pilgrimage as one, which is what many common folk at the time and how it was sold to them by the Pope and by the church. And he sort of more sort of lived that as like yes, like a sort of king's crusade. And um, of course, though it was yeah, no real fighting took place, and it was more of I think a symbol more than anything else. It was symbolic, but
Certainly.
yeah. So on May the in May 1147, a contingent of Crusaders left from Dartmouth and Devon, in the Kingdom of England. Quick side note: there was in uh, Exeter a pub which was one of the oldest in England, and it was built I think it was in 1150s, 1160s, and it was um uh, I was going to say, or a tavern. I guess you could say it was more of a tavern at the time, but it was um founded by members of the Knights Hospitals, who were coming back, and some of them had engaged in the Second Crusades, and they were coming back. Um, and this was some of it invest money and all that sort of stuff into it. Unfortunately, it was burnt down a few years ago, because some half-witted student left a photocopier on, but at the Exeter University. But that's a separate matter. So yeah, just sorry, side note there. Um, they intended directly from Dartmouth to sail to the Holy Land, but weather forced the ships to stop on the Portuguese coast in the northern city of Porto. And this was on the 16th of June. Um, there they were convinced to meet with Alfonso I of Portugal, who had declared himself the new king of Portugal. Portugal became a kingdom, I think it was 1139, around that time. So Portugal was a relatively new state, separate from uh, Leon, Castile, and sort of their neighbouring Spanish, what would become the Castile Spanish state. The Crusaders agreed to help the king attack Lisbon, um, with sort of agreement of sacking rights. Basically, the Crusaders would have the first rights to sack. Now, the caveat was they couldn't touch Christian property and Christian people in the city, but they could touch the Muslim and Jewish population, and goods and stuff was fair game. So the siege began on the 1st of July, um, and the I think the let's see, 17 weeks of siege, and then it was in October, 4 months later, um, Lisbon agreed to surrender, and most of the Crusaders settled in the city, um, but then a handful, we see on the map here, decided to go on to the Holy Land and sailed onward. Um,
And sorry, just to touch on before about the Norwegian Crusade. Sorry, I was right. There was actually a second Norwegian Crusade, which was a few years after the Second Crusade, from 1152 to 1155. So yeah, it was also known as Rognvald Kali's Crusade, who was the leader of it. So yeah, they just went on bit of an adventure to the Levant, but yeah, it was a bit of
was he
fighting that.
he must have been the one, because I know there was some Norwegians in the Crusade. They end up sacking like cities in southern Spain, in the Andalusia, and around off the Trafalgar and around that way. I'm assuming it was him, like because they actually did like land and did some old fashioned Viking maneuvers.
Well, interestingly, they actually got into a bit of naval combat with some Muslim ships, and so there was some Viking style battles with the Muslims. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, they still had that spirit about them. Um, I was going to say, Gilbert of Hastings was elected to the bishop, um, of Lisbon. and this, I guess you could say the legacy from this was it would begin later on, but this was sort of it's used by many, even to Portuguese. They sort of see it as the start of like the Anglo-Portuguese alliance in some capacity, or like the first um, Portugal's first ally in many ways. Um, Relatively new kingdom.
Well, it wouldn't begin proper until you had the reign of sorry, it was John the fourth, I believe, who was the founder of the Dioviz dynasty, because he married Philippa of Lancaster, who was John of Gaunt's daughter. So that's the formal beginning of the Anglo-Portuguese alliance.
Well, yeah, the official one, that was like in 13
The second half of the 14th century.
yeah, like 1380 something, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, Lisbon would obviously then become I think it would become the capital city of Portugal about a century later. Um, it and then would and that's all big. In funny ways, this was like the one you could arguably say the one success of the Second Crusade. If you include this in wider context, this was, from the Christian point of view, um, the sort of one success, and the Kingdom of Aragon, and particularly the Duke of Catalan, would also conquer a few. You can't really see it on this map, but he would slowly sort of slip down the coast and conquer a few more forts and territory from Moors, from Islamic Moors as well, uh, and so really in Iberia there was uh, better chances. Castile and Leon didn't really move much at this point, but you had you see here it was called um, the Almoravid Empire, which was um, this was a faction that born from Morocco, which and this political dynasty which spread across with their own school, I think within Sunni Islam, their own sort of like religious school as well, and very um, critical of the Umayyad sort of rump states, Islamic rump states in Spain, and they would conquer them. And this is a book going back beforehand, but this is where you would like what the 1060s, 1070s, and this is where you would have, of course, the story of El Cid would fight them, and of course famously be killed fighting them. And so this at this point the Almoravids are on the way out. They are declining in power and influence. They don't have the same vigor as before. Very similar to the Fatimid Caliphate as well.
Well,
They were
it's the
sort of
as identified by Ibn Khaldun about 200 years after this, the concept of asabaya, or group feeling, social cohesion. There's a tendency in Arabic or Islamic dynasties that after about 100 years, things start going to pot. Essentially, the dynasty, any kind of solidarity they have, breaks down and degenerates.
yeah, and it's funny because at this point in the Islamic world isn't really. I mean, the Arabs are sort of sort of twiddling they're sort of failing, and they're having to be propped up by Turks and Kurds and Persians and people really not from um, from the original stock of Islamic rulers. These were propped up by um, heavily propped up, as we would see.
No, certainly it's the Arabs never recovered from the anarchy at Samarra.
Yeah, yeah, true. And I believe Saladin. Was he a Kurd? I think he was a Kurd, wasn't he?
He was a Kurd, yes. He was an officer in the army of Nur al-Din.
Yeah. So, it's I was going to say very strange behavior by the Arabs. The sort of having a foreign warrior class. Even now, Bede, I sort of struggle to understand how that any of that is like a good idea by any capacity.
It's very complicated. Yeah, all I can say is I don't know, maybe they're more I want to say that maybe they're more unified by the creed of Islam, but that's not entirely true. They definitely have their own sort of ethnic resentments and conflicts. So
Yeah, yeah, no, true. Um, so getting back to the east, let's get my notes up again from the Second Crusade in the east. So we talked about the German. Um, so in so Conrad decided not to wait for the French, but marched towards Iconium, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate Rump. And so Conrad would split his army into two divisions. Um, and then Conrad underestimated the length of the march against Anatolia, and also assumed that the authority of Manuel was greater in Anatolia than in fact the case had been. Again, due to sort of more reaffirming of Turkic rule in the central hinterlands, which remained in place, and easy raids into the northern roads, and of course the southern coastal roads as well. You had more Turkic raids. Um, Conrad took the knights and best troops with him to march overland, while sending camp followers with Otto of Freising to follow the coastal roads on the south. The Seljuks met on with the met with Conrad on 25th of October 1147 at the Battle of Dorylaeum. So again, like we saw last time, Bede, with in the First Crusade, the Turks used their sort of most typical tactic of feinting retreat and then returning to attack with their cavalry. They would feint a retreat, and then while the lines are sort of spread thin by the Crusaders, they would then attack again, trying to break up and surround, mainly trying to encircle their opponent. I've noticed the Turks rely really on overwhelming numbers and strength to try and surround the enemy with feint retreats as as like their go-to tactic. And particularly this would work because the German force was a lot smaller than it would have normally have been if they hadn't broken up into two divisions.
oh, no, certainly.
Um,
But ultimately, I think the Germans pushing on without the French was a mistake as well. So
yeah, I think also there was um, from Comrade, he was possibly a bit of competition as well, or prestige that he wanted to be like the first one to have this great victory, and didn't really want to share it with King Louis, possibly as well. There was elements of that competition, so they weren't working together. Um, Unlike the Islamic rulers, they were more united, I guess you could say, and was all, particularly with the Zengi and the sort of Bedouin tribe and the tribes of areas that they had conquered in Syria and so on. Um,
Well, I think ultimately on the Islamic side, I think there was an urgency that the French have come in and they've carved out these Crusader states on our frontiers, and they're impeding onto the Dar al Islam, and so that I think there was a sense of we need to rally around this sort of great warrior king who is going to defeat the non-believers.
mm, um, and so the French Crusaders departed. I mean, their route. Just going to talk about them. They departed from Metz in France in June 47. King Louis departed, and he had Thierry of Alsace, Reynold I of Bar, Amadeus III of Savoy, and his half brother William V of Montefrat. Um, William the Seventh of uh, uh, Avignon, and the uh, other hosts from Lorraine, Brittany, Burgundy, and Aquitaine. A contingent from Provence, led by Alphonse of Toulouse. Um, and then he was also joined by crusaders from Normandy and England as well. Separate crusade force that set off from Dartmouth. For some reason, this was I did actually try to have a look why this was the case, why there were why different English knights went, one, they didn't sort of go as one, but went over to Normandy and then joined up with the French, and then the other ones that went with Flemish and joined up, um, and then sailed round the Atlantic. I couldn't find anything on this bead. The only thing I could find, which was interesting, was that there may have been um, um, the departure date may have not got through to all the crusading knights leading their um, vassals. That there was actually a breakdown. So the reason they left from Dartmouth was um, they had missed the original call, and the King of France was already off. So that's why the decision was to join with Flemish forces who were already travelling, German and Flemish forces that were travelling via the Atlantic Ocean. So that may have been not originally planned, and that the Portuguese were incredibly lucky that there was a larger force than originally planned to go along that route.
Yes, incredibly fortuitous.
Yeah, and then also the weather that sort of they forced the ships to dock in Porto in northern Portugal itself. Um, and so they followed King Louis and his host followed Conrad's route um, roughly without incident. Um, though Louis did come into conflict with King Geza II of Hungary when Louis um, allowed a Hungarian usurper, Boris Kalamanos, to join his army. Um, and so that caused uh, you know a bit of unfriendly atmosphere with the two. Um, and his same when marching into the Byzantine territory as well, the Eastern Roman. Um, the Lorrainers, who had marched ahead of the French column, also came into conflict um, with some of Conrad's Germans who they met on the way, and that sort of caused delays because of, again, um, it was over who had rights of passage on the roadways, who had priorities on the road, believe it or not, on the old Roman road, which is what caused the disagreements there. Um, when Louis arrived in the court of Manuel, the Manuel had already um, signed a truce with Sultan Mezid the First of Rum, and this was done because Manuel felt that King Louis may even attack him and the Eastern Roman Empire at this point. So this was him trying to defend from the Crusaders, um, particularly at this point where um, under Conrad and King Louis, both equally, there was a high level of theft and looting, um, which went largely unpunished. And as we remember with the First Crusade, there were somewhat penalties, but and there were attempts to try and prevent that. This time round, though, I mean, they were quite happy to, rob villagers and things like that. And for many Greeks, this was um, there was this underlining, fear, particularly from the Latin Crusaders, that there would be an attempt to attack Constantinople and install, someone as king of the Romans in the east.
Certainly, but just to allude to obviously this treaty with Masud of the Sultanate of Rum, as I said before, the Sicilians, despite being Christian and still there being an ongoing crusade, rather than fighting with the fellow Crusaders into the Holy Land, they decide no, they're going to raid the Byzantines, and so ultimately that's part of why Manuel signs this treaty, because he needs to try and redeploy his forces to protect his western flank.
Yeah, and it's the Pope Eugenius in this is completely useless because um I mean not to compare with Crusader Kings again, but if people who play Crusader Kings and particularly like on the second one, if you engage in a crusade and you're a Christian power, and then you're at war, or you attack another Christian power, you get like high penalties because it's like from the Pope in game, you get like negative effects and some sort of threat of excommunication penalty, because it's like, what are you doing? We're focusing our efforts on the crusade here. One thing you have here is, while the Normans, Sicilians are doing this, it, as much as you get from the Pope is like a don't do this, please stop sort of thing. It's like a strongly worded letter, effectively. There is real like no there is no real you know I guess you could say penalty from this, um largely because largely because there's this political reality that the Pope, for a crusade to work, he does need they do need the Kingdom of Sicily as it is now, and the Normans of Sicily as um, a strategic ally for this, and so they kind of get away with a lot, and this and the same with the Germans as well. With and I'll Bede, if it's all right with you, I'd like to just briefly talk about the Wendish Crusade. We're talking about penalties from like criticism from the church. One part of it, where we talk about the Wendish Crusade, where you had Duke Henry the Lion of Saxony, who was quite a legendary figure. I believe he had clashes with Conrad, and had designs over the becoming King of the Romans and Holy Roman Emperor himself. And it was very possible because during this time, Saxony and his realm was probably the most powerful and dominant of the duchies in the Holy Roman Empire, um, both militarily and elsewise, and also important bishopry as well, with Bremen as well, which had its own advantages. Before I move on to the Wendish Crusade quickly, did you want to mention anything else?
No, carry on, please.
Yeah, so in Same year, 1147. The bishops, I mentioned the bishops of Bremen and Magdeburg. Um, they had began the Bremen and Magdeburg, particularly Bremen, were the launch pads for missionary work for Christianization in Scandinavia in previous centuries, and they would be this would have the impact on uh, how Bluetooth and many of those um, Norse monarchs in converting to Christianity and establishing um, monastic uh, control in the newly formed Christian states of like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And also, there's at this point that there would be attempts in Denmark and Norway and Sweden to try and break from Bremen because of the power that it would mean as a bishopric. But regardless, in northern Germany and in that region, it was very powerful. And even when it came down to Christianization efforts with Poland. Now, at this time, in 1147, Bremen and Magdeburg would be sending missions to the Western Slavs, the last of the Western Slavs to, at this point, every other Slavic group, whether they be Pole, Czech, or the Southern Slavs or the Russians had accepted whether it be Western or Eastern forms of Christianity in Catholicism or Orthodoxy. The last group to do so would be the Wends, who would be a Slavic group that live, as you can see, up in Stettin. Up you'll see here in the northern Germany and Poland. It was mainly marshy land, and it was very, very sparsely populated in smaller tribes. But the leader of the Slavic, it's been described as like a confederation of tribes, Bede, by the I think it was a Saxon merchant in a letter I got here. Described it as the Slavic leader was a chap called uh, Nikolot, who was the chief or princes of the Slavic Obotrites and the ancestor of the house of Mecklenburg, which would become a prominent house going forward in northern Germany. And I mean, they would go on to be I think they would be going. I think it's the Queen. I think it's the House of the Netherlands and Sweden. They would that Mecklenburg would become inherit. So this was he was quite an important. He's quite an important figure in Northern Europe, and there are a lot of statues in Northern Germany to him, which I wasn't aware about in places. He's quite a interesting figure. So um, so the Slavic leader. So during the preparations for the Second Crusade in Holland, a papal bull was issued supporting the crusade against the Slavs. The Slavic leader Nikolot preemptively invaded uh, uh, Wagria, which is northern eastern part of Holstein in German state of Schleswig-Holstein. So that's the part of Germany that borders onto Denmark. And this was June 1147. Leading to the march of Crusaders later that summer, they engaged with Slavs immediately at Dobin, where you had an unsuccessful siege, and also an attempt to force a baptism on the local population. But but then they were repulsed from the nearby settlement of Demmin. Another crusading army marched on the Christian city of Stettin. So this is where it gets a bit controversial. At this point, the Slavs of Stettin had already converted to Catholicism relatively recently. And when they arrived, they were met by members of the church, where the same bishopries that would send them there then had to quickly turn around and say, "Oh no, no, no! Don't sack the city because you'll be stealing our, you'll be sacking our own treasures." And it the uh, the Crusaders then dispersed pretty soon after, and it's largely considered a failure because it didn't resolve in the conversions. What would happen is this region of Last Isles, the Danes would later on, I think a decade later, would invade, and they would then be occupy and lead to conversions, but also they would encourage German migration into these sparsely territory, and so there would be the uh, Polabia population would largely just be assimilated into the German-speaking population, or they would travel eastwards into Pomerania, which was also at that point would also come under the control of parts of Denmark and then Poland. Um, According to Bernard of Clairvaux, the original preacher for the Crusade, the goal of the Crusade was to battle with pagan Slavs until such a time as, by God's help, they shall either be converted or deleted. However, the Crusade failed to achieve the conversion of most of the Wends. In preaching the Crusade, Bernard had urged not make truce or accept any form of tribute, but the Crusaders did receive tribute from Nicolot, as mentioned, which contributed to Bernard's perception of the Crusade as a failure. The Saxons achieved largely token conversions at Dobbin, where you had members of the Slavic chieftains, so like the local nobility, who would accept conversions, and then soon after the Crusaders would leave, they would revert back to paganism as a form of worship, and wouldn't accept the bishopry of Bremen or Mecklenburg authority. Albert of Pomerania explained, if they had come to strengthen the Christian faith, they should have done so by preaching, not by arms. There was no Wendish clergy established, nor any Christian literature translated into the language of the Wends. And so largely the Pomeranian, Poles, and Czechs contingents were very critical of this, and this was regarded by everyone as a failure. And for Duke Henry the Lion, this was seen as largely competent, but he was affected by being attached to this, and it was for him one of the only times he took a bit of a loss to his public image. Do you have anything to add, Bede, at all? Anything you wanted to ask or say?
No, it's very interesting what you've been saying. Carry on.
Yeah. And then as I said, within 20 years, the Saxons would go on to expand eastwards and conquer large parts of the Wendish territory anyway. But a lot of the German nobility would sort of blame Henry for allowing the Danes to assert political control over the region. Even a younger Frederick Barbarossa would blame Henry for this and have a falling out when he was an older older gentleman. So yeah, that was seen as a um, pretty poor thing, and it it would have an effect in the sense of not many people in Christendom were convinced when you have a later Northern Crusade against the Prussians that it would be successful, desirable to financially back, and would have sort of only positive returns. But of course, that will be another stream for another day.
I know, certainly.
So that was the Wendish Crusade. So we'll just get back to and what's quite funny, Bede, is all of this happens in June. I've just noticed all of this has happened in June 1147. So all these, I do wonder if this was by coincidence or this was like planned. That it was like, okay, everyone, you need to leave. You need to leave your holdings by June, and then begin travel immediately, sort of thing, to your to the Holy Land or wherever.
Very well organised.
Yeah. Um. So where did we get to? Do you want to talk about the journey to Jerusalem at all? Louis' journey to Jerusalem.
Well, in terms of the journey to Jerusalem, yeah, so Louis' arrival had been delayed by storm. So he arrives in Antioch on the 19th of March, and he was welcomed by, obviously, because when he went on crusade, Louis actually took his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, because people forget, right, Louis VII of France was her first husband, and it's only after the failure of this crusade that she ends up divorcing him and then marries obviously Henry II of England. But her uncle was Raymond of Poitiers, who was the Prince of Antioch at this time, and so Raymond had expected that Louis would help defend them against the Turks and help him on an expedition against Aleppo. But Louis refused, saying, "No, I'm going to finish my pilgrimage to Jerusalem." So again, it's very conflicted sort of objectives here. Where Conrad is clearly coming for military purposes, Louis seems to be seeing it more as a pilgrimage opportunity.
Yeah.
But then from there, Louis sort of advances down, going for Tripoli, until he eventually arrives in Jerusalem.
And Fulk, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, sent Louis an invite to join with him and Conrad. The fleet, the naval fleet that fought at Lisbon at this time also arrived, as well as the uh, uh, those from Provence under the command of Alfonso Jordan and Count of Toulouse. Um, though Alfonso did not reach Jerusalem, he died in Caesarea. And there was also mentioning that quite a few, you had uh, uh, Amadeus of Savoy died in Cyprus along the way. So there were quite a few of the leaders that didn't actually make it all the way um, to to Jerusalem. Now, one thing that we talked about the Crusades. Now we haven't actually mentioned one very important figures in Crusades, which I think the average member of the public, if you mention the Crusades, they'll probably say this order, and that's of course the Knights Templar, who um would you say they're overrated, Bede? Would you say they're slightly overrated as an order goes? The
um,
mythology behind them is slightly out of control.
I don't know, maybe a little bit. I don't really know enough about them. All I know is that obviously they're a bit mired in controversy because obviously they famously supported Guy of Lusignan, and obviously during the lead up to the Third Crusade, where they were both when they were beaten at the Horns of Hattin, then obviously their reputation during the Albigensian Crusade and the massacre of the Cathars as well, and then of course I think I mentioned this in our last stream, but you had their downfall at the hands of Philip IV, Philip the Fair of France, where he has the Pope abducted, and then the Pope declares them a heretical organisation, and Philip the Fair seizes all their property and has the Grand Master burned at the stake.
Yeah. So a quick recap: the Knights Templar were founded as a military order based on the site of um, uh, the Temple Mount and Solomon's. Uh, of course, you have the Solomon's Tomb and tunnels and temple. The Templar Knights were their sort of ethos was the combination of warriors who were to adopt the Benedictine code and the esoteric sort of Catholic nature of this sort of merger of a warrior monk, and you would have ideally they would be sworn to complete chastity. They could not be married. They couldn't engage in um, you know relations that like monks today, right? Members of the church today, they have to be totally dedicated to the order. There was element of secrecy to the order and its rituals. A certain Julius Evola talked about actually the Templar Order in a sort of um, from a pure like warrior perspective, as sort of like as a spark of a um, as sort of like the warrior spirit, you could say. And these were um, some have said compared them to the samurai. I can understand that comparison, but I say it was more steeped in um, less of a code and more of a religious, esoteric religious um, uh, order than anything else. Even though that they were just total warriors, um, and they were at this point they were responsible for the defending of several forts along the Transjordan, as well as their holdings in Jerusalem. You also had but the funny thing is, Bede, is they weren't really that prominent at this time. The main knightly order were the Knights Hospitals, who were um, more under particularly under Baldwin II, they were more prevalent. They were a far more prevalent force. And then you had the Knights of Saint Lazarus as well. There were many orders, but the Templar orders, their mystery um, is what makes them the sort of interest and particularly with popular culture as well. And as you said, the various stories with Guy of Lusignan, and also with even the Third Crusade as well. They will be a prominent role in future endeavors. But the Knights Templar would, in this scenario, um, they um, uh, the focus on recapturing the Countessa was the preferred target of Baldwin III and also the Knights Templar. But the Knights Templar was focusing more on Damascus. They wanted to go for Damascus. Um, and this is where you have the probably go on to what the siege of Damascus. Um, did I miss? Oh, and in between, you did have the Council of Palmyra, So that's when the Bede of Jerusalem welcomed the arrival of the Crusaders from Europe, um, and this was the decision of where to attack, and it was largely split. The orders, and particularly led by the Templars, wanted to attack um, the Damascus as an immediate threat to the kingdom, but Baldwin III wanted to retake Edessa. And the Crusade, and I will say this for the Templars, their argument for Damascus was that the Zengi's had uh, the Zangwids, there was a sort of power vacuum between Una and the Zangwids, between the Emirate of Damascus and the Zangids. So there was this almost this feeling that assessment that if they were to attack Damascus, you wouldn't have to worry by the collective forces of Mosul, um, Aleppo, and Raqqa coming down on them.
No, certainly. And I think by going for Damascus, Damascus is the closest major city, and obviously it's a base of operations if you're going to attack the Crusader state. So I do see the logic in going for it, because obviously later Nur ad-Din would use it as his capital and base of operations, and later Saladin would as well. So
Yeah, it's a major city at this point, and it, relatively speaking, Damascus, it's very close to Palestine, and at this point it'd be very close. It's a capital which is close to the borders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. I think it's within a couple of days march of their border, so it's yeah. So according to William of Tyre, on the 27th of July, the Crusades decided to move to the plain on the eastern side of the city, which was less heavily fortified and had much less food and water. It was recorded by some that Unu had bribed the leaders to move to a less defensible position, and that Unu had promised to break off his alliance with Nur ad-Bin if the Crusaders went home. Meanwhile, Nur ad-Bin and Saf al-Din had arrived. With Nur ad-Bin in the field, it was impossible for the Crusaders to return to their better positions. The local Crusader lords refused to carry on with the siege, and the three kings had no choice but to abandon the city. First Conrad and then the rest of the army decided to retreat to Jerusalem on the 28th of July, though for their entire retreat they were followed by Turkish archers harassing them. Um, and so, yeah, that's the siege of Jerusalem. The Muslim population were the Muslims were prepared for the attack, and the Crusader force just broke down, and Conrad decided to leave.
no, certainly it's a total disaster and a complete victory
Um,
for Nur ad-Din.
yeah. In the aftermath of this, Conrad did. I think he went on to attack Ascalon in the south, um, but no other sort of he had no support from the Templars or any of those in the vassals in the Kingdom of Jerusalem due to their um, quote unquote, I think from the Templar order um, head, the just pure cowardice is what he what he refers to it as, and so just total distrust for a generation. Um, After quitting Ascalon, Conrad returned to Constantinople to further his alliance with Manuel. Louis remained behind in Jerusalem until 1149. The discord also extended to the marriage of Louis and Eleanor, which had uh, been falling apart during this crusade. And of course, as um, we know what happened there. But Eleanor, who um, wasn't really on speaking terms by this point, boarded a separate ship to take them back to France. So there you go. They were on two separate ships. Um, Bernard of Clairvaux was humiliated by the defeat and considered it his duty to send an apology to the Pope, and is inserted in the second part of his book of Consideration. There he explains how the sins of the Crusaders were the cause of their misfortune and failures. When his attempt to call for a new crusade failed, he tried to disassociate himself from the fiasco of the Second Crusade altogether. And in some ways, he was true that there was because it became. I actually think because you had kings governing it and sort of deciding upon it, unlike the First Crusade, there was like a greater political angle to this, and I think that blinded a lot of those involved. Um, when you look at the um, siege of Lisbon, that was all done by very low level barons and knights from England and Scotland and Germany and parts of France. That was done by those purely I mean, yes, under the command of Alfonso Portugal, but it was also due to their original true faith of the crusade, with the crusades though being conducted by monarchs. It is almost like not a crusade, it's more of as I say, just a normal political uh militarily campaign, and it has all the problems. Conrad didn't work with Louis at all, unlike before when you had Peter the Hermit or the papal legate, who at least in the First Crusade he kept all the leading crusading figures together, even when they were antagonizing each other. We talked about Tanqueray last time, antagonizing, um, the uh, Hugh and other crusading leaders. They were able to sort of at least keep them together on the same page and cooperating with each other.
No, certainly. And what's also interesting is looking at the relationship because Conrad, after he left the Holy Land, he went back to Constantinople, and he actually ended up becoming friends with Manuel Komnenos, and which is interesting. And whereas what ended up happening is, despite obviously the good relationship there, which Manuel would hope to use as an alliance, unfortunately Conrad would later die, which wouldn't lead to anything. Unfortunately, due to people such as Bernard of Clairvaux and other chroniclers of the Crusades, Byzantium walks away with a very negative reputation because it's seen as treacherous and duplicitous, not helping the Crusaders and even directly working with the Muslims against them. And so
Yeah,
this enmity ultimately leads to a further breakdown in the relationship, and obviously culminates in the Fourth Crusade ultimately.
yeah, and Asanias of Thessalonica, Archbishop, he declared that Manuel was able to deal with his enemy with inevitable skill, playing off one against the other with the aim of bringing peace and tranquility. When it sort of so you had the Orthodox Church coming out swinging from Constantinople in defense of the emperor's decision for a treaty, but of course Louis would go around the courts back in Western France and openly saying that the Manuel was collaborating with the Turks, with the Muslims, and uh, that sort of had well, total breakdown in relations with France and the Eastern Roman Empire.
No, exactly.
Um, so apart from that, the uh, Baldwin III seized Ascalon in 1153. So and which brought Egypt into the sphere of the Crusader states more directly. and then I believe he even briefly occupied Cairo in the 1160s.
Well, what happens is then, as you're getting the declining Fatimid Caliphate, both the Zengids and the King of Jerusalem are fighting over Egypt to try and conquer it, which is something the Zengids would ultimately win under the leadership of the general Shirkuh, and obviously the uncle of Saladin. And
Yeah,
yeah, what happens is Saladin's made the Grand Vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, and then the last Fatimid Caliph dies, and then Nuruddin dies, and Saladin, then from there launches a campaign into the Levant. He takes Damascus and then declares himself the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. And what's also interesting, again, another angle of supposed Byzantine treachery is Manuel had actually agreed to help the Crusaders launch an invasion of Egypt in 1169, but that didn't ultimately lead to anything. So again, there's this idea that Manuel for a second time has sort of let the side down, so to speak, according to the Crusaders anyway.
yeah, and of course, Manuel died in 1180, and then only 7 years later, Saladin captured Jerusalem after the death of uh, Baldwin, of course, the leper king, and this would trigger the Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, and that where we will go to inevitably next, hopefully with Iron Duke, because that would be probably a very very again be a good stream, but yeah, that was let. What lesson do we learn from this? Don't trust the Greeks, and the Germans and the French can't work together.
Well, I don't really blame Manuel for his conduct. I mean, I would
No, to be
do the same.
fair, yeah. To be fair, then I mean, yeah. To be fair, the Normans were the trouble was it was the Normans from Sicily, their constant raiding and everything. It forced Manuel's hand to behave in the way that he did and seek a truce um with the Sultan of the Rum, and also the constant the crusading army sort of looting and pillaging their way across Eastern Roman lands didn't exactly install the goodwill, I guess you could say. So yeah, maybe I'm a bit harsh on the Greeks there.
Well,
Maybe I'm a
one thing I
little bit
will
too.
say is Manuel's treaty with the Turks would later come back to bite him, because ultimately Manuel's interesting because he's got his several fingers and several pies. He's interested in expanding to Anatolia. He's interested because there's actually a moment AI where the kingdom of Sicily collapses into anarchy, and he sends troops there, and Byzantium very nearly reconquers southern Italy, but that fails. He has a pretender seated on the throne of Hungary, so Hungary's a nominal ally of his, but that doesn't go anywhere because that claimant ends up dying. And the final tragedy of Manuel is, I think it's 1178, a couple of years before he dies. There's a disaster where he notices that the Seljuk of Rum is getting too strong and it's consolidated itself in central Anatolia, so he decides to launch a campaign. And this goes disastrously at the Battle of Myriokephalon, where it's in the mountains and the Turks are able to catch the Byzantine army off guard in an ambush. And to Manuel's disgrace, he actually flees the front lines into the rear guard. And as a result of this treaty, he's forced to sign another agreement where he again agree. He has to pay tribute. He's not allowed to advance beyond the mountain frontiers into Turkish territory, because at that point, I think the Turks had been paying him some tribute as like a nominal vassal, and so the Turks effectively become independent as a result of this battle, and they have it confirmed by Manuel. So yeah, this forever kind of broke his spirit really, and he died a sad and bitter old man a couple of years later.
Mhm. I do find when particularly with I mean one thing I always find when you look at the history of particularly from Emperor Zeno onwards, when you really have like an established Eastern Roman Empire, or Roman Empire, the continuation of Rome in the East, it has, you have your high under Justinian, and then it's just like doom scrolling levels of depression when it comes to it. It's like a very slow, very slow decline. I mean, you do have like rebounds in some areas, but yeah, it's the Eastern Roman Empire is just this absolute yeah, they're being pushed by the forces of the West and the East, and it's it's inevitable, because they couldn't just hold off against that level of pressure. Um, I do
Well,
want to.
well, the point I would make is, well, it's incredible how long they lasted, considering all that pressure.
Yeah, yeah. I think the walls of Theodosius was the Theodosian walls, or around Constantinople. Their fleet, Greek fire, the Great Chain, that and also their ability to, hire mercenaries. They were able they were able to have, you know it, they were able to continue a lot longer than many other empires would, even when they got down to their lowest point. I would say I do want to, at some point in the future, to talk about the um what battle is it? It's the uh not Kosovo, but
Do you mean the Crusades against the Ottomans, so Nicopolis and Varna?
yeah, Necropolis and yeah, that's right. Particularly Necropolis and but Vara as well. That one would be, maybe even Kosovo as well. We do like a separate one, but that's where, you know
As
the
in the conquest
Ottomans.
of Serbia by the Ottomans.
Yeah, yeah, and that we'll talk about like the Ottoman expansion into Europe, and the the East, the Byzantines effectively just becoming a city state with various patchworks in the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and um, you know other parts of Anatolia. That would be quite a good idea. But anyway, thank you, Bede, for joining me today to talk about this, and we'll see you all next time with the Third Crusade. Um, and then after that, we'll obviously do the fourth, and I guess we can continue in chronological order, near enough. Um, and possibly, I'm thinking after the Fourth Crusade, we'll do a stream on the Northern Crusade. So that would be the Teutonic Order. At first it would be the Livonian Order, but then and also the Teutonic Order against the Baltics, the Latvians, Estonians, and also the Old Prussians, not to be confused with the Germanic Prussians, but the Baltic Prussians, and the creation of a Teutonic state in Prussia, which would become the basis, of course, of the Prussian kingdom and relatively modern Germany that we all love today. So until then, everyone, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, AI, and yeah, we'll join you soon.
Join you soon. Yeah. Thanks, Bede.